What's up, big dog? Long time no see. I'm a guy named Fuzz. This is Defeat the Monster Within, and I've got a juicy one for you today. I didn't practice this at all, but I've been working on this whiteboard for weeks. Mostly because I've been busy and procrastinating at the same time. So that when they get in tandem with each other, it creates this thing where you can put stuff off for months. But I've been working on it for weeks, and I think I've got most of what I want to say jotted down up here on the whiteboard, or at least, bits and pieces of it that'll help me remember what I want to tell you. So, a lot of things we're going to talk about. This is like a disclosure, full disclosure thing. We're going to talk about some weird shit today, okay? Some abstract things, and a lot of this is not going to make a ton of sense unless you've seen some of my other stuff and you kind of can understand where I'm coming from, because we're going to dig into some stuff about God's law versus man's law. We're going to be talking about some strange terminology. This might be a long one. I'm not sure yet because I'm not done making it. Obviously, we just got started, but we might end up going on for a while here. The name of the video here is called The Contract. I realize that by calling it The Contract, and just by referring to this stuff as a contract type of a thing, it's going to throw a lot of people off. The first thing we need to recognize before we even jump in at all is this contract is not a contract like you would typically think of a contract. As you can see from the different font styles, kind of, like it's come in bits and pieces, and I've been working on it, I've been studying, I've been reading, and I've been trying to figure out how I want to put this all together and wrap it up for you so that you can understand what I'm trying to get across here. So, with that being said, we'll dive into the content here, and hopefully, as we move along, I can explain it well enough that you can at least wrap your head around it to some extent, and you can see what we're talking about here. The law merchant. This was one that I was struggling with on how to describe it, but when we look at international law, I'm not talking about like your statutes or your bullshit that the cops are going to give you a ticket for, right? I'm talking about like real fucking laws. International law is about as basic as it gets, and people tend to be afraid of it because it's so complicated and the terminology is really weird and it's hard to understand, but it's like when you actually read through this shit, it's about as basic as they could describe a fucking transaction. It's like, if you have some stuff and you put it out for sale and then someone comes and sees your stuff and likes it, they can take it and then they will give you money for it. And there's like rules of the deal, like the most basic essence of law. The trippy thing about it, one of the trippy things about it, I mean, there's a fucking million things that are trippy about international law and just law itself. But one of the trippy things is the international law that every country in the world has agreed to use to make their laws is written as, it's called the Uniform Commercial Code. So it's written as commercial law. So they don't even bother writing an international law that doesn't have to do with commerce and interacting with like in a money type of sense, which is pretty fucking weird. I mean, I could go off all day about why that's really weird. I know a lot of you watching this might not think that that's very weird. That's just the way things are, but it's bizarre to me that we're not writing laws about, how we treat each other just in general. We're writing laws about how we treat each other in commerce, and that's the most tantamount, that's the highest law of the land that there is. Typically in America, when people say the law of the land, we think of the Constitution, because it says that's the law of the land. I'm pretty sure it says it in there. I don't know. I thought there were some other things I read in the Constitution that turns out weren't. I read them somewhere else. So we'll get into that in a minute. But the law of the land that I'm referring to here is not the Constitution. I'm talking about like the law of Earth. The law that everyone on Earth, basically, maybe not everyone, but all the governments and the established shit on Earth, basically everyone that there is has agreed to these international laws. So all of those laws are like, number one, they are the ones that can't be broken, and if you break those laws, they're going to be this consequence, much like a contract, which we will get into also in a minute. But you got to understand There's like certain concepts and principal foundational concepts that you really have to have a grasp on before we can even try to dig into the other higher level, the weird shit that I really want to get to. So basically the gist of how the law works, right, is that you have your international law and all the countries agreed that they will follow that international law. And then inside of each country, you come to America, you have America's law, which is the federal law. It's the U.S. Code. So the U.S. Code is like the highest law in America. It's like the number one. That's the everything in America that has to do with law has to abide by the U.S. Code. And it's, I don't know the exact terminology right now. It's not coming to my head. I want to say subservient, but I don't think that's the right term. But it's basically, you have international law, then you have federal law, and then you have state law, and then inside the state you have the county law, and then you go into the municipalities, like the city law, and they're all like, the city law has to agree with the county law, and then the county law has to agree with the state law, and so on and so forth, all the way up the chain, right? So that if the state makes a law that is not in accordance with the federal law, then that law is void. It's null and void. And all of these say this, and they're very careful to write their shit to make sure it agrees with the things above it. Okay, if that makes sense. I'm hoping that makes sense. That's just a kind of a foundational concept we need to understand before we dig into anything else. But when we come back to the law merchant, and what I was getting at before is, when you read through these international laws, yes, they're very basic, but they're also worded in peculiar ways. Ways where you say, why would you say it like that? Like, why couldn't you just say it normal? Why did you have to word it this weird way so it would fit? And it starts to make more sense when you start to look at the definitions of the words, because they start to define things differently than you would expect. Okay, here's a good example that kind of tripped me out when I first learned, and it seems so basic that it makes perfect sense, but it's the way they twisted it and the way they've also taught us in school and society that are so slightly different, but just enough to really fuck up the way that you're actually perceiving whatever it might be. So the word without. How do we typically say the word without? The best example I could think of is like, oh, I'm going to have to go without something. I'm going to have to go without milk for a week. That would be a normal way to say it, right? So that's typically the normal way I would say without. Like, I'm going to have to go without firewood for all winter. Something like that. That makes sense. That's like the natural way you'd say it. But the way we define without, saying it like that, and the way they define it legally it's defined as the opposite of within, which actually makes a lot of sense. So they write things down like, are you within the United States? And of course that sounds like it makes sense, because we are, I'm in California. Yes, I must be within the United States. That makes sense. But then when without is defined as the opposite of within, and then you say, I'm without the United States, now the whole meaning of the thing changes. And there's like certain documentation shit that I've literally actually sent it to the government. I've sent it to the fucking president and to the Secretary of Treasury and shit. Like, I've mailed things to the government, and it was explicitly stated that I'm without the United States, because the United States, that we typically think of as a place, right? But it's not a place. The United States is a corporation. And so when you decide to remove yourself from that corporation and operate individually, then you're no longer within that corporation. You're without that corporation. So now, when you're saying I'm operating without the United States, it sounds like you left the country, like you flew to fucking Cuba and you're hanging out in a different place. But what's really going on is it's just a change in the meaning of what's already happening, and the changing of the wording of the way things would already happen. So these changes in the wording they're just peculiar. The way they do it and the way they change the definitions of things. Like the way person, we would think of a person as like another human being, but person is defined legally as like any entity, right? So this is where we're going to start getting into the law merchant stuff. We're going to be able to dig into some good stuff soon here. The definition of person legally, and this goes across the board. This isn't just international law. This is like anytime you look up any kind of law, they'll have a definition section, and if you go and look up the definition of person, it talks about how it never says human or a living, breathing, flesh and blood human being. It never ever says that. And if you say that to them in court, that you tell the judge you're a living, breathing, flesh and blood human being, they get fucking pissed. They're floored immediately. And I know this from many, many times of experience, so please take my word for it. But it never mentions in the law that you're a living, breathing, flesh and blood human being. No, it mentions you as an individual, and then it lists off all the other things that could be a person. And it's like a corporation, a trust, this and that. Like all these different things that are businesses, right? The Uniform Commercial Code. We're operating under commercial law. Everything is transactional. A person is not defined legally as a human being. It's defined as all these different things. And if you look into the international law and the definition of person, it mentions like any entity. It says something about any entity. I almost want to get out the book right now and read the exact thing, but this is where things start to get bizarre, right? When it mentions that any entity, and after it lists off, individual, corporation, trust, yada 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 yada, all these different things that you think of as like business related things, and then any entity, it blends right in. But when we think of being able to contract with another entity, now things start to expand. Our ideas of what that might mean start to change, especially when we stop thinking of things as man's law and what the people of Earth have agreed to, and we start to recognize that there's a separate set of laws, even higher than that is God's law. And it's the laws of how things work in the world. It's the law of how things work in the world above that international law. So it's even more tantamount and more of a powerful authority. When they talk about the law merchant in the international law, they talk about the law merchant a lot of times like it's an entity, like the invisible hand of the market. This is the law merchant. So this is basically, they write about it in the law as like this is just the most basic rules. Like I was talking about earlier, it's just the most basic it could get. But there's a lot of times it's worded kind of weird, and it sounds like they're talking about a person. Like the law merchant is like a dude that's hanging out there at the market, watching what's going on and making sure everything's okay, like a security guard or something. It's kind of fucking weird. Let's just kind of skip around here, because I wrote this all up off of my notes, and I'm not sure how all this is going to work. So the law merchant here, I heard some stories. I personally have never done DMT, but I've heard about people doing DMT. I watched this cool documentary on it when they were like figuring out what it was, and they were dosing people up with like what they figured was a non-lethal dose, which was like an insane amount of DMT. So they'd go on these like crazy fucking trips, and they'd come back and they'd like tell these insane stories of what happened while they were high. And it would only last like 10 minutes, but they'd have these crazy stories. It was a cool documentary. I forget what it was called. They would talk about having these experiences where there were things like knowledge and wisdom, and these were entities. They were entities that exist in this other realm that you could go to, and you could like, when you're in this other realm, you could like go and meet wisdom and talk to wisdom, which is a trippy concept to understand just all by itself. Like I think it's kind of impossible to really understand it without actually experiencing it. But it starts to open up ideas about what other things might mean. And I understand that loses a little bit of credibility. We're talking about people being high on some extreme drug and having weird experiences, but a lot of people will report this like similar experiences. And the trippy thing also is not necessarily meeting entities like knowledge and wisdom, but when people just with no drugs just go into a meditative state. There's this guy called Dr. Joe Dispenza. He wrote a really awesome book. It's called Becoming Supernatural. I highly recommend reading that book. But he talks a lot about like being able to meditate and get into this state of being nobody in no time and no place. Which it's easy to say and it's kind of fun to say, and it sounds cool, but it's so difficult to fully understand of what it's like really trying to get there. So that's another video for another time, but it's bizarre the way that they talk about the law merchant, and it insinuates that there might be something going on behind the scenes that they know about. The way they write the law, it's like they know about it. Like they know where we came from before we were alive. It's weird. There's a bunch of other shit written like this, and so that's just another, I guess, a little bit of a foundational idea building up on what we're really getting at here. Another thing, in these old treaties, like before America was a country, back in the day, they would write treaties, and they were like, these treaties, I don't know about the treaties that are like, common knowledge that people know about, because I don't study that kind of shit, because it's a waste of my fucking time. I study the weird behind the scenes shit that's like, nobody knew about it. And there are some treaties that I read about in some of these books I have, and I was like, there is no fucking way that's real. There's no way that that's a real treaty. Like, this dude has to be fucking high. There's no way that's real. And I Googled one of them, and I dug through like probably about 18 pages of like Google results. And I finally, after like searching through a bunch of this shit, I found a weird, obscure .gov website. That's why I clicked on it, because it was a .gov website. So I was like, okay, it's got to at least be, semi-legit. I guess, who knows? Maybe it was totally fucking fake. This guy made it himself, buried it under 18 pages of results, and he happened to be able to buy a .gov domain name, and so he did it just to trick people like me. Maybe, maybe that's what he's busy doing with his time. But I doubt it. So I click this .gov website, and I find this treaty, and what do you know? It is word for word what he has written in his book, saying what they did in this treaty. I won't get into that, because if I talk about what they said in this treaty, or if I say the name of this treaty, they're going to probably block my channel. So that's just to give you a little context of how deep this shit goes. And this is something that happened in like, I think it was like the 1600s. It might have been sooner. I forget now. I'd have to pull the book out, but I don't want to get blackballed for naming names here, because you know the sensitive 2025 world we live in. Let's just go ahead and move on, because this is a little bit of a different idea. But we'll skip to the birth canal thing. Like there's stuff written into law where they talk about coming down through the birth canal, and the way they talk about it, it sounds like it's like an actual river, like you could sail a vessel down. And they talk about you as the baby being like the vessel sailing down the river out to be within whatever world we're in. Like, it's fucking bizarre the way they word this stuff. That's kind of what tipped me off, was one day reading whatever they had written in there about coming through the birth canal. And they, like, every person legally, basically your name is not really you. It's a legal entity. So basically, as far as the law is concerned, we're all on the ocean, and we're out to sea. And I've even had some very credible sources that I've talked to over the phone talking about how they basically legally see all of us as people, normal people. We're lost at sea. Fucking bizarre. Let's just put that on the back burner for now. Let those ideas start to juice around in your mind. And let's go to the high contracting powers, because some of these old treaties that they're talking about, it's like a treaty between like the king and the pope and the high contracting powers. Literally, they're not even named as their title of, like, nobody's gonna know who the fuck these people are. It's like, these are the dudes with the money. These are the guys that pull the strings. We make shit happen, and we're gonna go have a meeting with the king and the pope to make sure that these top dogs that people view as being the top of the religion and the top of the government, the two top guys, let's go make a contract with them and decide how shit's gonna work. So this is some scary shit, right? So, knowing how scary these contracts can be and how much of an influence they can have on the rest of time, let me give you one more little back tidbit about the Magna Carta. I think it was signed in like 1213. Don't quote me on that. I think it was around 1200. But basically the king was being such a fucking tyrant that some dudes came and fucking probably kicked his ass. Who knows how it really went down. They probably fucking snuck up on him, jumped the motherfucker, beat his ass, and then they wrote their own contract to make what the king does be fair. And they probably told him, dude, you're going to sign this contract or we're going to fucking kill you. And then we'll take over as king and we'll sign it ourselves. Who knows how it actually went. But basically they forced this king, I think it was King George, not sure about that either, I get them mixed up because there's a bunch of them, but I'm pretty sure it was King George, and they fucking, some guys kicked his ass and made him sign this contract, which is bizarre because every contract in the world pretty much ever since then has had to be in accordance with that contract, because it's so original, so all encompassing. It's and it's called the Magna Carta. You can look it up. Contracts can get pretty fucking weird, as we've seen, as I've explained so far and spent so much time elaborating on how weird this shit can get. The freedom of contract. Certain establishments and governments and what have you, it's not like they have a freedom of contract clause or anything. I read somewhere in one of these things of all this shit, because, I have this wealth of information swimming in my head. It's one of the things I read somewhere talked about how we have the unlimited ability to contract. And that idea is a radical idea, and it can radically change your life. Because we do have the unlimited ability to contract. Let me get into my what if questions. These are some notes that I took because I knew I couldn't fit everything on this whiteboard. I probably need to get a bigger whiteboard that fills up the whole wall so I can really get all this out. But let me just ask you a few what if questions to get your mind flowing and thinking about just what if. What if you could sign a contract before you were born? What if we did sign a contract before we were born? What if you could sign a contract in an unconscious state? And who knows how conscious we may have been before we were born? Right? What if we were supposed to remember something while we were alive from the previous realm that we made this agreement in? So what if we made an agreement before we came through the birth canal into life? What if the whole point of life is to remember that thing and to perform that duty? Right? Because we look at every contract has rules. That's how contracts work. If you do this, this will happen. If you show up to work every day and do your job, you'll get a paycheck at the end of the week. If you show up at work and you fuck up, we're going to tell you to go home and we're not going to pay you anymore. Action, consequence. That's how every contract works, and every contract has certain explicit ideas. If you do action A, you'll get result A. If you do action B, you'll get result B. And that's how every contract works. And they might have a series of these. If you do action A, you'll get result A. If you do action B, you'll get result B. If you do action C, you'll get result C, etc., all the way down. Endless amounts. So what if, as an unlimited entity, before we were born, we made some elaborate contract, and we made some elaborate agreement with another entity? Another entity maybe the law merchant, or knowledge, or wisdom, or God. Oh, that'd be weird. What if we look within instead of looking anywhere else? What if we could lay in bed and engage in contracts with God without ever putting a pen to paper? What if? What if we're already engaged in a contract with God? What if part of that contract is that we could make adjustments to the contract while we're laying in bed talking to God? That's an interesting idea. It's an if-then agreement. That's how they all work. That's how every contract is. If you do this, then this. If you do that, then that. It goes beyond our bodies, right? This is where things are going to get weird. I told you this was going to be a weird video, okay? Now, let's just briefly buzz over invisible contract. Invisible contracts are a thing. There's literally a book written that's called Invisible Contracts. An invisible contract, a good example of an invisible contract would be like a restaurant or a taxi, right? So if you go to a restaurant, there's a reasonable expectation. Let's just touch back too on the definitions thing. If you go into the real law and the international law and the state law and the federal law and all this and read what the definition of a contract and agreement is, it never says anything has to be written down. They talk about how it's just basically coming up with terms and having an agreement. Let's go Article 1, General Provisions, Definitions, 29. So I'm reading it from my book here. Agreement. as distinguished from contract, means the bargain of the parties in fact, as found in their language or inferred from other circumstances, including course of performance, course of dealing, or usage of trade as provided in section 1303. Now we'll read the definition for contract. Contract, as distinguished from agreement, means the total legal obligation that results from the parties' agreement as determined by the Uniform Commercial Code, as supplemented by any other applicable laws. That's a pretty weird one. You might want to rewind that and listen to it again. It's distinguished from agreement. And then it says that agreement is part of the definition. Isn't that peculiar? And it's the total legal obligation that results from the agreement. So if you go into a restaurant and you order food, there's a reasonable expectation that you're gonna pay for the food. So they bring you the food, you see the food, you say, okay, this looks good, you eat the food, now you're done with the food. You don't have any legal standing to say, I'm not going to pay you for the food, I didn't know I was supposed to pay. You can't just go eat your food and then say, oh, I didn't know I had to pay. There's no contract, I didn't sign anything, I'm going to leave. You still have a legal obligation to pay them for eating the food. Same as you get in a taxi. You know when you get in a taxi, even though you don't sign anything, you get in, you tell them where you want to go, you see the meter fucking ticking up with the dollar amount as you're driving. So you can't get to your destination and say, oh, thanks for the ride, and hop out and then be like, oh my God, I didn't know I was supposed to pay. And then to think you have legal ground to stand on. So that's what we're talking about with the way that shit works. So invisible contracts are obviously a thing. So if we can make contracts that are not on paper just by agreeing, and we can also make contracts with whatever entity is willing to contract, ooh boy, I wonder if the monster might be willing to contract. That's an interesting idea. So let's start to get into the real trippy shit here. Okay? This is the part that I like. There's this movie called Paycheck. He's like a government worker and he does like these super top secret jobs. Basically does these jobs and then when he's done they like erase his memory so he can't remember what he worked on. So he like literally, it's that top secret, which is just a trippy idea. I just wanted to touch on this because maybe these are signs and they're not coincidence. It's another one you'll have to go back and watch. The Truman Show. I feel like this a lot of times. Like, it's like Murphy's Law. You know? Everything that can go wrong will go wrong and at the worst possible time. And how does that always seem to happen unless somebody's fucking watching and like making it happen as you're in the spot? Like, it's just a peculiar idea, right? And if you start to expand that idea of like, what if God is watching? What if the monster's watching? Maybe that starts to make more sense. Instead of thinking of it in a movie sense, maybe start to think of it in a spiritual world, in a spiritual realm of expanding just our perception of the way we're seeing what we're being shown. And then I put Divergent on here also because Divergent just kind of, me and you watching this, if you're still watching this, then you're here too. You're a divergent. We're going against the grain. We're going off the path. We're going somewhere different than everybody else is going. And I think that's important for us to do. I think it's important for us to walk this new path and to show people how to do it and to demonstrate and to build steam and build numbers. If you go back and watch my video about the yin and the yang, it's called God's Gift, I think. A Dance with the Devil. I talk about how the yin and the yang, you got to be grateful for the good and the bad. And this is something huge with the contract, because the contract, the good and the bad is all written in. Everything that has happened in your life, that will happen in your life, has already been written into the contract as a possibility of what may happen and what results you may incur if you perform those duties. And this is something that sort of, we already kind of fucking know, right? You know, if you work out every day, you're going to get buff. So if you follow that rule and you live up to that aspect of the contract, then you get the result that is guaranteed to you by that contract, right? If I fucking drink booze every day, I'm going to be an alcoholic. It's going to destroy my body, right? That's the consequence of the contract, because you, in that case, and it all kind of, this part depends on perspective, right? But you could say I violated that part of the contract and got this consequence, and then I fulfilled this part of the contract and got this result, the reward. But it's across the board. You're going to, if I do this, then I get this. And that's just about as basic as it gets in life. Whether we did sign a contract or not, this is kind of the juice of the point I'm getting at with all of this, okay? Let's just entertain for a minute that we did sign a contract before we were born. And the contract basically said that if you want the most beautiful, excellent thing that you could imagine in life, then you have to do all this other stuff before you get that. Just like any contract would. It would say you have to do this, and you have to do this, and you have to do this. And then once you're done fulfilling your duties, you will get the result that you want. And if you don't fulfill your duties, you won't get that result. You get this other result, or, maybe a whole muddled up gray area of other results. Who knows, right? So, this is the cool part. This is the part that makes the whole thing kind of special and amazing, and a booming idea that will shatter all the fucking bullshit and give you the ability to enjoy your life no matter what happens. It's powerful to live by this idea because it creates faith. So what if you believed, let's get back to those what if questions. What if you believed that everything awful and everything terrible that maybe has happened or is happening in your life is a part of the contract that you already agreed to, and you agreed for those things to happen so that you could get the result that you wanted. Maybe you agreed to fuck up your life for years and years on end so you could learn to grow, so at the end of the contract, when you're done doing that, you'll get the result that you want. Because maybe you needed to fuck up your life, or maybe you needed awful shit to happen, or maybe you needed the people you love to fucking have terrible things happen to them, or fucking die, or whatever it might be. Maybe that stuff was part of the contract that you already agreed to before you got here, and maybe you were just kind of supposed to remember that even though all that terrible shit happened, that's okay. Because in the end, you're gonna, what you will get in the end as your result, as your reward, will be worth it. And you knew that when you signed the contract, and then you forgot when you got here. And it's just your job now to just remember that shit's okay. All that shit is okay. Because you're going to keep going, and it shows you that all that shit is okay. And that you can just keep going and keep moving forward and keep looking forward with excitement for what's to come, no matter how bad it gets. And it might hurt in the moment, and you might be fucking devastated, but you can still say, this is just good. This is another thing moving me closer to my ultimate destination that I already wanted to go, that I already agreed to. And maybe, what if none of it happened by accident? What if you got to design the entire thing before you even started? You got to design your entire life from A to Z before you lived it. And so it doesn't matter what you're going through on A or B or F or G or fucking W. Don't matter, because you know when you get to Z, it's going to be exactly what you fucking wanted and exactly what you designed. What you wrote, the contract you wrote exactly for yourself of exactly how you want it to be. What if? Thank you for watching this. If you're still here, you're going places. I love you guys from the bottom of my heart. I'm very glad you're here. I hope to see you again soon. Keep kicking ass.